It's a Friday, and I'm going to talk to you about two emails I got this week because people really need to learn etiquette on how to write emails politely. And I'm baffled by this. But the first one, I got an email from a guy who said, Steve, I bet you $100 you can't make a video about each of the first 10 amendments. You don't have the skills for it. And then he wrote, I'm serious. So I wrote him back and I said, number one, betting me $100 that I can't make 10 videos. And by the way, it wouldn't just be 10. The First Amendment would probably require 3 or 4 videos all on its own. Same with the Fifth. So it would probably be like 20 videos. But to bet me $100 that I couldn't make 20 videos at your whim, it's not really a bet so much as just a stupid challenge. But then to write, you don't have the skills for it. You don't have the skills for it. Guy writing me was not an attorney. And I do make videos. And I do talk about the law. But to say that I don't have the skills for it. So I wrote the guy back and I said, I'm really sorry, but number one, I've mentioned before, I don't take bets or do challenges unless you're going to pay me my market rate, which is $750 an hour. So if you want to pay me to make 20 videos and $750 an hour for the shooting and production time, I'll do that. It won't be a bet, but the thing that is bothering me the most about your emails when you wrote you don't have the skills for it, in which case, why'd you write me? And so it might be the guy thought that was funny. I don't know. But I got one of the oddest emails yesterday from a guy who claims to be an attorney. And it has nothing to do with the law. I'm pointing that out because I would have thought as a professional courtesy, an attorney would be more polite. But I got this email, and I'm just going to read it to you. What's next? A Union Carbide Bhopal tee? And he's apparently referring to the fact that the other day I wore a shirt that said Calumet and Hecla on it. Calumet and Hecla. And for the 99.9% of the people in the audience who don't know, Calumet and Hecla was the name of a copper mine in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And it was the largest copper mine in the Keweenaw. As the largest mine up there, it was the one that drew the most attention during the strike of 1913. Okay, so I was wearing a shirt that simply had the logo of the Calumet and Hecla mine on it. By the way, the other day I wore a shirt that had the Quincy Mine logo on it. And I occasionally wear things that are historical in nature and also things from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. But he is comparing Calumet and Hecla to Union Carbide and the Bhopal accident where people got killed by leaking poisonous gas from a plant, I believe in India. And he is suggesting that Calumet and Hecla apparently killed people the way that Union Carbide killed people. And so that was the headline. What's next? A Union Carbide Bhopal tee? And then he wrote, and no, dear Steve, no. As a kid in Southwest Michigan in the 60s and 70s, I was still hearing stories handed down from my great-grandfather about the horrific conditions and treatment miners suffered at the hands of Calumet and Hecla. It was a mild shock to see you wearing a tee reflecting nostalgia for those heartless bastards. I assume you don't know the full story. Hang on, I gotta underline that. I assume you don't know the full story. Or you wouldn't have worn it. Here's a decent summary, although based on what I grew up hearing, it understates. And then he refers me to an article in American Heritage magazine. I know the author of the article, and I've read the article many times, and the article is actually filled with countless mistakes, but we won't get into that. He wrote, I generally really enjoy your content. I generally really enjoy. I kind of sort of don't really enjoy. I generally really enjoy your content and don't have a grudge based on this. I just thought you should be aware of how, and I can't say that word, Calumet and Hecla was. And then he wrote best, and he signed his name. Now I'm saying his, it's actually a name, it could be a woman's name too. It's a unisex name, so I actually don't know. It could be a woman, but I'm suspecting it's a guy because most of the hostile emails I get are from guys. So I wrote him back and said, "You're funny." I wrote a book about the Italian Hall disaster. To assume I don't know the full story is actually a strange way to address this. Now, here's the thing. As many of you know, I wrote a book about the Italian Hall disaster, which I told him because apparently he didn't think that I knew anything about it because I assume you don't know the full story. And in case you're curious, just for giggles, here's a copper ingot that says CNH on it. Calumet and Hecla. This copper was mined at the Calumet and Hecla mine. That is a lead ingot from another mine over in Wisconsin or Minnesota. I forgot which state. That's a Calumet and Hecla lead ingot, because they also made that too. Over here, off camera, but always next to me, is a chair from the Italian Hall disaster. And what he's getting at is that the Calumet and Hecla mine was the big mine in town when the Italian Hall disaster happened in Calumet. And he says, I assume you don't know the full story. Well, I wrote 2 books on it, actually 3. I've written magazine articles about it, countless articles on the internet. I've done videos on it here. I was a technical advisor for the PBS documentary on it called Red Metal. So I actually do know the full story. And so what I'm getting at with this rant is that if you saw me doing something you thought was so horribly off base that you had to write to me and say that you were shocked by what I had done or said, and to say, I assume you don't know the full story, you should actually stop yourself and go, wait a second. Is it possible he does know the full story? Because this guy or gal does not know anything. Literally, they know nothing, because the story that they sent me is filled with nonsense. And so if I said to you, you really need to know more about modern whaling, and I sent you a copy of Moby Dick, you go, okay, that's not how we find out about modern whaling. And so the article that he sent me, the link to, is filled with nonsense. It's actually a bad article. And people in this community, people who study the Italian Hall, actually mention this article as one of the ones that is an extremely bad example of writing on the topic. It gets so much wrong, it's not even funny. But if you thought that I made a grotesque error, misstatement, or faux pas with what I was wearing, you should write instead and say, hey, Steve, or dear Steve, which is actually more proper, but hey, Steve, I'll accept. And you go, hey, Steve, I noticed you were wearing a Calumet and Hecla t-shirt. Now, I'm familiar with a mine called the Calumet and Hecla in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Is that what that t-shirt is for? And I'm curious, why are you wearing it? That's all you got to ask. Why would you wear it? And you don't have to say it's a bad thing, it's a good thing. I'm curious, why are you wearing that shirt? And I would have told you and said, well, you know something, I've written a lot about the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. My family's from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and I spend a lot of time in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. My great-grandfather worked in the mines, okay? And I've met lots of people who are descended, have ancestors that they are descended from who also worked in the mines. And the Calumet and Hecla mine, of course, was a huge presence up there during the strike, and they were there until 1968. They eventually got bought out by Universal Petroleum, and they went out of business in the 60s. The last vestige of the company, I believe, was a tube and pipe company in South Lyon, Michigan. But Calumet and Hecla, the logo that I had on that shirt, which I bought at Copper World, by the way, about 5 blocks from the site of the Italian Hall disaster, that is a player in the story. But there were a lot of players in the story. So if you've read my book, and I know some of you have, book's called Death's Door. It's available wherever fine books are sold. If you read Death's Door and understand exactly what happened there, somebody ran into a crowded children's Christmas party on Christmas Eve and yelled fire, caused a panic, and 73 people died, and there was no fire. So you go, okay, and Calumet and Hecla was the big mine in town, right? Yes. And the striking miners were striking, many of whom worked for Calumet and Hecla. Yes, that's the connection of Calumet and Hecla to the story. What I would tell you, though, is the idea that this person is good and this person is evil. Oh, that person is good. Are they good or evil? That person? Oh, they're evil. Sometimes history is more nuanced than that. And so you have to ask yourself, Calumet and Hecla being the big mine in the area, what was their role in the disaster itself? What was their role in the disaster itself? Okay? Well, the miners went on strike and the company refused to recognize the union. And a standoff ensued and lasted until April. However, if you were to ask the workers, many of whom lived in housing owned by Calumet and Hecla, they had every intention of returning to work and paying the money they owed once the strike was over. That's what the workers would tell you. But also we know that the man who yelled fire was most likely a strike breaker. The strike breaker was from out of town, probably New York, but we don't know that for certain. And he'd been hired by, not Calumet and Hecla. He was hired by the county. Strike breaker was hired by the county. Calumet and Hecla was merely the mine that employed the bulk of the workers who were on strike. So does that make Calumet and Hecla evil? Or does that make them good? And I'm purposely emphasizing that because very few things in life are pure evil or pure good. And so Calumet and Hecla was the big employer in town. It was actually considered to be one of the better employers in the terms of what they provided for their workers, but of course they would not recognize the union. Neither would any of the other mines, including I wore the Quincy shirt recently. Quincy Mine, they wouldn't recognize the union either. And yet I didn't get angry emails saying, why'd you wear the Quincy shirt? So the interesting thing is, I'm reading between the lines here, I assume you don't know the full story, is that he's saying that somehow Calumet and Hecla was behind the Italian Hall disaster. And if you really want to get complicated and say, well, if they had recognized the union, then there wouldn't have been a strike, there wouldn't have been a party, that's probably true. But none of the mines recognized the union. And I think there were 10 or 15 mines up there at that time, all of whom had workers out on strike. And at that time in America in 1913, most businesses would not recognize the union until they were forced to. And so it took labor laws to be changed a few decades later where they actually said companies must recognize unions for collective bargaining purposes. And until that law came into place, these mines did not get unionized. Now, if you said, Steve, if you went back and ran the company, would you run it differently? Well, with modern sensibilities, I would. But you do understand that that's how it was in America in 1913. All of the mines were like that. Now, if you're going to say, but Steve, maybe he's getting at the working conditions. Maybe the working conditions of the mines are bad. The working conditions of the mines are horrible. I've talked about this before. On average, one man per week died in the mines in the copper country. But that's all the mines. All the mines. And interestingly, people would tell you that getting a job at the Calumet and Hecla was probably better than getting a job at the Champion, because the Calumet and Hecla was bigger, and they're in Calumet, and they did things like they built hospitals, libraries, bathhouses. They lent out the property for churches to get built on. Now, that benevolent paternalism has been criticized in later years, but if you were a worker simply looking for a job and you had no skills, and the Calumet and Hecla would hire you, well, you take the job. Now, I know some people are still going to say, but Steve, you know something? It still seems odd that you would wear that shirt knowing that they're somehow even remotely connected to this story, right? I mean, aren't the strikers the heroes? And in my mind, they are. In my mind, they are. And guess what most of them did at the end of the strike? They all went back to work at Calumet and Hecla. Almost every single one of them. So just in case you're curious, in 1913, the year the strike started, in 1914 the strike ended. During that time frame, Henry Ford announced $5 a day workday in Detroit, working above ground where you aren't going to die being crushed by rock. Some people did leave and go down and work for Henry Ford in Dearborn. So a lot of the immigrants came to America and went to the copper country, then went down to Dearborn. That is true. Huge numbers of the strikers stuck around and went back to work at Calumet and Hecla. So if you want to, you can look at Calumet and Hecla and say, Steve, I'm simply looking at them for that little slice of moment, that little slice of time where the Italian Hall disaster happened and Calumet and Hecla was there. There. They weren't the guy who cried fire. They didn't hire the guy who cried fire. And the building they were in wasn't owned by Calumet and Hecla. And the only real connection is that these children were the children of striking miners, most of whom worked for Calumet and Hecla, and most of whom went back to work for Calumet and Hecla after the strike was over. So the idea that I don't know what I'm talking about, and I assume you don't know the full story, or you wouldn't have worn it. What does that shirt stand for? It says Calumet and Hecla, and it's the company's logo. Yeah, they were there, and they're a big player in the story, but I'm trying to get across here is that the story is a little more nuanced than to simply say, oh, they're bad, they're good. They're bad, they're good. So I would ask the man or woman, whichever that might be, who claims to be an attorney in Washington, have you ever driven a Ford automobile? Ever driven a Ford? Ever been in a Ford? Do you know about Henry Ford's publication history? Things he published? Are you aware of the Battle of the Overpass? That was actually people hired by Ford going after strikers. And yet, you still buy Ford products? You still drive in Fords? Ever worn something with a Ford logo on it? And so if you want to, you can dig up anything. I wear a Detroit Tigers shirt quite often. There's the Detroit Tigers shirt. I'm surprised you didn't say, hey, Ty Cobb was reputedly a racist. And you're wearing that shirt where Ty Cobb used to play baseball. How can you do that? And by the way, occasionally I do get complaints about shirts I wear. But it's usually by people who don't understand what they are. I wore a Shepard Fairey shirt for a while that had a Shepard Fairey logo on it. And somebody goes, I didn't understand that you were a Satan worshiper. Apparently, Shepard Fairey shirts indicate Satan worship. And I've also had somebody upset about the shirt that said send lawyers, guns, and money, which is a reference to lyrics by Warren Zevon. And a guy goes, Steve, there was a shooting 3 weeks ago or 2 weeks ago. You can't wear a shirt like that so recently after a shooting, which means you could never wear that shirt in America. But back to this guy. I assume you don't know the full story or you wouldn't have worn it. But then here's a decent summary, and he sends me to a bad article. And the only thing that could have been better about this email is if he'd referred me to myself, because that happens all the time. It happened last week. Last week, somebody on Facebook actually went underneath a video that I'm in and commented and said, someone needs to talk to Steve Lehto about this, and put a link into one of my other videos. And that's happened more than once. And I've actually gotten an email from somebody who said, Steve, you made a comment about, and you clearly need to read a book on that topic, and they sent me a link to one of my own books. And I don't think this was done ironically. I think it's literally people who didn't know. And so this guy here, who says that he got his story handed down from my great-grandfather about the horrific conditions and treatment of miners suffered at the hands of the Calumet and Hecla. But he's clearly talking about the Italian Hall disaster because he says that you need to read the article about the Calumet tragedy, which, by the way, it's not a tragedy, it's a disaster. There is a distinction, believe it or not, but we won't do that today because we're running out of time. So again, history can be nuanced, and don't fall into that trap of this is all good, this is all bad. I know there are some examples, but the vast majority of reality is nuanced. It's nuanced, okay? So when you complain about the Calumet and Hecla shirt, you ought to complain about the Calumet and Hecla ingot, but be aware of the fact that I've got an Italian Hall chair right here, and it's been on my set for years, and will always be on my set. So, yeah, I don't know the full story, apparently, so maybe I should go read a book or two that I wrote. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.